Psalm 111 is quite a contrast to yesterday.
Mhm.
Yesterday is about an oracle in which King David or King David's soldiers hear a word of God about the power of a king. And again, the ambiguity is who is the king, who is hearing the oracle, and even less so, what does the oracle mean? But that as well. Today, a total shift. This psalm, Psalm 111 and 112, are called twin psalms. They're twins structurally. They're both composed of 10 verses in which distinctly the alphabet, is an acrostic, but in phrases. I'm currently preparing Psalm 119 because it's so long, 176 verses. It's the longest psalm. It's 8 verses for every letter, there being 22 letters to the Hebrew alphabet. So I'm getting an early start since I've already completed Psalm 111 and 112. Bottom line, Psalm 111 and 112, rather than being a verse that begins with an aleph, is a phrase. And the rabbis will have different opinions as to why. So Rashi and Radak will say this is a psalm about wisdom. And because it's about wisdom, the message of the acrostic is that you have to proceed like the alphabet, step by step. Others will say that these psalms are wisdom psalms. Psalm 111 is about the nature of God and God's goodness. Psalm 112 is what does it mean to be a person emulating that goodness. And so they are paired. And the second dimension of why they're put into alphabetical order is that it's easier to memorize. These are wisdom psalms meant to be sung, meant to be memorized. And the third explanation given is that it's like from A to Z. They are meant to be all encompassing, at least symbolically, in terms of the nature of wisdom itself. Again, Psalm 111 is about who is God. It's, in that regard, a short poem of God's goodness, which will touch on that God is the creator who gives us choice, who motivated us to create, gave us laws to create, calendar to memorialize God's goodness, that God provided, be it manna or the conquest of the land, but did so with a essence of truth and justice, pointing toward revelation and redemption. So that's a lot of content. And as we'll see, without further ado, it is a compact psalm with a lyrical quality. The closing line of the psalm, verse 10, gives context to the whole, and that is the beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai, a good understanding for all their doings. God's praise stands forever. Tehilato, God's praise, is the envelope, both Yud He Vav He, intimacy, and praise, as the psalm begins with praise be God and Ode Adonai, I will thank Yud He Vav He. I
Mhm.
will add that the middle of the psalm, and I'm still counting the words of psalm, sometimes I overlook sharing it, but I don't want to overlook today. The middle phrase, the bullseye, Yizkor le'olam brito, in verse 5, God will remember forever God's covenant. So that at the core of this psalm is the reflection that God will forever remember. What God does is enduring, and that God has a covenant, a relationship, a written expectation of relationship that is at the center of our praising God, because to praise God is also to have relationship with God. One last thing to highlight, and that is the repetition of words, which is, as we know, how Psalms conveys what is the message. The key word that is repeated in Psalm 111 is asa, do. It's repeated 6 times, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, which is to say, how do we know God? By what God does. That too is the message of this psalm. And it leads to 2 other words that are repeated, each 3 times. Le'olam, which can mean forever or enduring, and yireh. I translate yireh, as do others, as awe. It's more commonly translated as fear. So back to the closing line. The beginning of wisdom is fear of Adonai. That's one way to understand it. I'm going to do some riffs on how the rabbis understand this word yirah, but it seems to encompass more than just fear. It's praise, it's wonder, and in that sense, awe. Again, awe is both awesome and awful. Awe is the reflexive response of wow. Okay, Psalm 111, taken from the phrase at the end, the beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai. Hallelujah. I will thank Adonai with all my heart in the secret counsel of the upright and in the congregation. Great are the works of Adonai, available for all who desire them. Glory and majesty is God's activity, and God's righteousness stands forever. Memorial was made for God's wonders. Gracious and compassionate is Adonai. Food was given to those in awe of God. God will remember forever God's covenant. Strength of God's doings were told to God's people to give them in a state of nations. Doings of God's hands are truth and justice. Trustworthy are all God's precepts. Set firmly forever and ever. They are done in truth and uprightness. Redemption God sent to God's people. Commanded forever God's covenant. Holy and awesome is God's name. Beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai, a God of understanding, full for all their doings. God's praise stands forever. And so this morning, I'd like to approach this psalm a little bit differently, all the more because yesterday left me struggling with the awareness of how much there was to say that was interpretations that had historical dimension. What I'd like to do is just share some of the moral teachings that this psalm prompts. But I'll start in the middle with verse 6. So I want to show you, not unlike maybe yesterday, how some of these verses have been used as prompts for the rabbis in their commentaries. Verse 6. Koach ma'asav, the strength of God's doings, higid la'amo, were told to his people, letet lahem nachalat goyim, to give for them an inheritance or an estate of nations. Rashi is the most consequential commentator in the Jewish tradition. In that, the first book ever printed using the Gutenberg print in Hebrew was Rashi's commentary. Rashi was 1040 to 1105. That was done in the 1500s. And later, when books would be printed with commentary to the Bible, the early printed books would put Rashi on the inside margin to protect them with paper that was more brittle. Rashi's very first comment to the Bible quotes this verse, verse 6. Rashi lived in France 1040 to 1105. He would experience the Crusades toward the end of his life. But already throughout much of his life, there was this ongoing debate as to who had the right to control the Holy Land. And so Rashi's opening comment asks the question, why do we need all these stories of creation? Is not the purpose of the Bible just to give us laws so that Israel knows how to have a relationship with God? It should have started, according to this earlier midrash found in the Tanhuma that Rashi is quoting, with chapter 12 of Exodus, which begins with the first law to Israel, this month shall be to you the head of all months. And Rashi answers, the reason that the Bible begins with creation is so that in a future time, Jews can say the Holy Land is ours. We have God's deed. And then this line is quoted, verse 6. I have given to them an estate of nations. In that midrash, this is quoted to say, God is saying to all the nations, when you will debate who's the true possessor of the land of Israel, it is the people of Israel. And so I share that because, not unlike yesterday, it is to me remarkable and wonderful how these words of a psalm ripple forward and have an impact that you would not expect just in the flow of the psalm. This psalm, again, is a description of God's goodness. So some rabbinic comments in that regard. The opening line, I will thank Adonai with all my heart in the secret counsel of the upright. So here it's besod yesharim. Literally the word sod is secret. The image here is that the psalmist is meeting with those who are, be they fellow Levites or those who are teachers. So I will meet secret, meaning closed counsel of the upright, a limited group, and in the public space, in the congregation. And some of the commentators will say, fast forwarding to the time of Oprah and popularity of books that have secret in the title, that what is going to be revealed here about the nature of God is not to be esoteric. It's not to be a secret. It's to be shared with the congregation. So I meet with the inner council in order to teach the larger community. And what is it that I seek to teach? Gedolim ma'aseh Adonai. Great are the doings, the work of Adonai. Drushim l'chol chavtzehem. Available for all who desire them. And now that seems to imply choice. So verse 2, available for all who desire them, can be understood as hakol biyadei shemayim chutz miyirat shemayim. Those are words of the Talmud quoting Rabbi Akiva, who says, all is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of heaven, which is to say, a cornerstone of the Bible, a cornerstone of rabbinic teaching is the power, the ability to affect change, the power of choice. So greater the works of Adonai, it's a choice to appreciate them, to see them, to know them, and yet they are available for all who desire them. Also, by the way, because of the nature of Hebrew, this can also be understood as they are pursued by all for their desirability. So a different way of understanding, very different, but this is often and the way I felt identified, because ultimately what this psalm is about, back to the middle phrase, is about choosing to be in relationship with a God of wonder. Verse 3, glory and majesty is God's activity, and God's righteousness stands forever. Here too, it moves into from works of Adonai to the nature of Adonai as revealed in those works, which is God's tzedek, God's justice, God's righteousness. That is why God is worthy of praise. And we'll see tomorrow what will make people worthy of praise is doing what is right. Of course, that's a larger conversation of how one knows or what it means that God does right. I read a commentary that said maybe the reason, this is I think Richard Levy, that we describe God in human terms is so that we can then see what we have described as our role model. And at the core of this religious expression of who is God, God is righteous. Verse 4 and 5 are in the Rosh Hashanah Amida prayer. Memorial, Zecher, was made, again, the emphasis on doing, for God's wonders. And the rabbis will understand this as referring to the commands of the Bible to observe the Shabbat, to observe the holidays, to make memory of moments of wonder and more in Shabbat, the creation itself. And back to God's nature. That's again the focus. Chanun v'rachum Adonai, gracious and merciful is God, is Adonai. And that echoes Exodus 34:6, which is after the golden calf, and Moses said, reveal to me your glory. And God says, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun. You know, Adonai, Adonai is gracious and merciful as God forgives. And so God is, verse 4, a forgiving God. And in that sense, there is, though not said directly, a recounting of the history of God and the people in the Bible, which also tariff. Now, this is an acrostic, right? It's in alphabetical order. And the word here used for food, tariff, works to be a tet, but it is rarely used in this way as food, though there is an example of it being used elsewhere for food or supplies. But usually tariff is like treifa. It's that which is torn from an animal and not kosher, but it can be neutral, though that's the exception. But here, the commentators will say it's chosen because it works for the acrostic. Food was given to those in awe of God. That's probably referring to manna. But again, it all exists in this poem on two levels. It can either refer to a moment of the past or ongoing. God sustains us. God will remember, now that middle phrase, the bullseye, God will remember forever God's covenant. At the core of this past, present, future, a sense of relationship with God that is enduring and ongoing, is that God remembers. God is faithful, is loyal. Verse 6, strength of God's doings were told to God's people to give them an estate of nations. Again, I talked already about how Rashi and the Tanhuma use that. That points back to the Bible, to the promised land. and can again point to the present and the future. The doings, the works of God's hands are truth and justice, emet umishpat, trustworthy, ne'amanim, kol pekudav, are God's precepts. Here an emphasis on law as what is sustaining of relationship, of creation itself, but it's laws that are emet, truth, and mishpat, justice. Smuchim, set firmly forever and ever. Again, this emphasis on how God, in contrast to humans, is enduring. And once again, this emphasis on the qualities of God's nature, emet, being repeated. See, verse 7 and 8 has the same word, truth and uprightness, so that precepts or justice is to be yashar, straight, predictable. Emet, truth, becomes for the rabbis one of the names of God. Redemption, verse 9, God sent to God's people. Now that could either refer to Egypt or it could be looking forward. Commanded forever God's covenant, coming back to the covenant. Holy and awesome is God's name. Now God's name again is God's signet, how God is manifest. A name, although spoken, is our identity. God's identity evokes awe. And again, this word norah, awesome, can also mean fear. That leads to the last line. A line that is often quoted. It's quoted in the Zohar. I will tell you a little bit about how it's used. Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai. The beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai. Seichel Tov, a good understanding, good intelligence, L'chol Oseihem, for all their doings, or for all practitioners. God's praise, Tehilato, Omedet La'ad, stands forever. So, commentaries on this important line. First, it echoes Deuteronomy 10:12, among other places. My friend Brad Artson, who's so dear to me in so many ways, while he was the rabbi at Temple Eilat so many years ago, took a paragraph of the Bible and laminated it and kept it in his wallet. And it was this beginning of Deuteronomy 10:12. Va'ata Yisrael. And now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask from you? Ki im lirat Adonai hecha. For if to fear or have awe for the Lord your God, to go in all God's ways, to love God, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. And then the paragraph continues to say that means clothing the naked and taking care of the needy. But the image there, as Moses gives his final address to the people, he begins, what does God request from you? To fear the Lord your God, which is a mindset of awe, of wonder, of catching your breath when you consider, as I have another friend, Ruvain Sella. He was a poet I met in Israel. I was once on a beach with him, and he said, looking at the things on the beach and the beauty all around us, he says to me, you know, a mindset is to see everything around us as an artwork, but with the creator not needing to sign. God is the creator, and everything is an unsigned artwork. That's a mindset. It's a way of seeing the world that leads for our psalmist to both wonder, wow equals holy, and more. Wonder leads to the belief in a caring creator who endures and endures through law, who endures through justice, through care for the needy. That's the continuation of Deuteronomy 10:12. In the Talmud, Shabbat 31a to 31b, there will be a full discussion among the sages on what does it mean to be in awe of God. And there'll be some analogies used. One rabbi will say that awe is like a preservative. And when you store grain, but don't include the preservative, it all goes to waste. Another will say that awe is the key to the outside vault, to enter into the world of God's presence. And even if you're given the chachma, right? Reshit Chachma, the beginning of wisdom, is fear of God. So even though you may have the key to Chachma, the inner vault, if you don't have the key to the outer vault, the fear of God, it does you no good. And another rabbi quoting Ecclesiastes 3:14 would say, Vaha Elohim asa, and God made sheyeru milfanav, so that there would be awe before God. I shared you'll see it in my description of tomorrow's reading of Psalm 112, which is what is a person who is a reflection of God, that Eliezer Rokeach of Worms. Worms is a city along the Rhine in Germany. He was actually born, I believe, in Mainz. He, who suffered so much during the Crusades, would say, in reference to why do we always call this need Yirat Adonai, the fear of Yud-He Vav-He, rather than the fear of Elohim. He says Elohim is the God of judgment, the God of punishment, the God who is distant. Elohim, the Yud-He Vav-He, is the God of intimacy. We say it because our relationship to God is a product of love, not the fear of punishment. Where fear comes into play, Eliezer Rokeach of Worms says, is the fear of losing the relationship because we are so dependent on God's love. One last comment, and that's from the Zohar. The Zohar will identify this opening passage, doing so in 1:7b and 1:8a, as doing the following. Bereshit bara Elohim. With Reshit, the world was created. And then this verse will be cited. With Reshit, with beginning. And what is the beginning? The combination of Chachma, that's the higher sphirot of God's mind, and Yirat Adonai, which in the Zohar is Shechina. Shechina is the feminine presence and is seen as the entry point, the gateway to God. Yud-He Vav-He is all 10 sphirot. In order to access and gain Chachma, to gain that inner wisdom, the highest level, one must begin with Shechina, the lowest. And why Bereshit, the bet, meaning with these two, bet being two, like the letter B, second letter, with Chachma and Shechina, that is how one gains entrance to the whole of creation. So I put that out there only to close, honoring my years of the study of the Zohar with Danny Matt, and to say this closing line has great richness. The beginning of wisdom is a mindset. Awe of Adonai, a good understanding for all their doings. God's praise stands forever and ever. And this closing line will lead till tomorrow with Psalm 112. Happy is the person who has awe of Adonai. Ashrei ish yireh et Adonai. With that, there's a lot more to share. Perhaps your comments will allow me or evoke some of those thoughts. I get to see you now. And in reviewing this Psalm 111, any questions or thoughts? Ken or Shula, go right ahead. You have to unmute.
Unmuting does help.
Yeah.
One very small thing, and then another comment. The very small thing is that looking down the alphabet, that tzadi is missing, and therefore I assume that in verse 9, the word tziva must serve as the missing tzadi, because tzadi follows pei. And so that would be, unless it is like the ashrei where the samach is missing and it's just missing forever. But I don't know.
You are right. Here, actually, thank you for saying that. In that, the way it's structured is there are 2 letters for each verse, except the last 2 verses are 3 letters. And I'm going to go back because of your sensitive reading, Shula, and now darken the tzaddik in verse 9 that I overlooked doing. And so that the structure, and it'll be the structure tomorrow, is every verse has 2 letters except the last 2, which are 3 letters. And therefore, in the 9th verse, you get the pei, the tzaddik, and the kuf. Thank you for drawing that to my attention.
I also wanted just to be on the record as saying, and I've said it before, that I do not ever agree that the word yirah means fear, as so many of our very wise and wonderful ancient rabbis say, because I always feel there is a certain negativity to fear, as if you weren't afraid, maybe you wouldn't even do it. I rather see the word yirah with the root of ro'eh, to see, that means that people see God with so much depth that they are able and willing and wanting and anxious to give the respect, the honor, the love, and to follow all of God's teaching, the seeing of it, not ever the fear. But that is my personal thing about that.
That's great.
I love that.
I do.
Linking, I'm glad Marvin also chimes in.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You can add something, Marvin.
No, I agree with her entirely. I think a better definition of the word is awe.
Yeah.
A-A-W-E.
Though that's why I often play with the awe being both awesome and awful. When I ask people about holy moments in their life as a way, as a prompt to talking about when have you felt close to God, people will often describe, the birth of a child, but they'll also describe their brush with death, meaning a moment that felt awful that can also evoke our own creatureliness and our own gratitude. So, but back to your point, Shula, and I'm glad, Marvin, you echoing that. And that is to say, I love your correct, it's there, linking this word yira with to see, lirot. It is what we see. And again, in this psalm, what we see are God's acts, God's doings that evoke wow. And I like the word wow as a contemporary word for awe. It's reflexive rather than intellectual. And that's why I love that, and I just read it preparing this psalm, that inside of Eliezer of Rokeach, that we don't say Yirat Elohim, which is the God who punishes, which is how we or many use the word fear, the fear that God will, send the lightning to strike you down. Rather, the Yud He Vav He, the Yirat Adonai, is the God of Rachamim, the God of mercy and compassion. And so that, I think, is back to your sensitivity, beautifully highlighted by Eliezer of Rokeach's insight. Miriam?
Yes, I was thinking about that. I think to me, the difference between awe and see is a matter of closeness. When you see, it's more personal. It's a heart to heart thing, whereas awe is up there, over there. It's not as calling to you as seeing is. When you see somebody, you're talking about really understanding who they are.
So, and they're related for me, Miriam, in that and Shula also said that regarding how she used the word see. When you see beyond the surface, that's what this is also saying. That's this line, available for all who desire them. You have a choice. And the other, to see it or not is somewhat a choice, a preparedness to see. And the quality of yira is a reaction, is even a spontaneous, meaning it's more than intellect. It's that which is core responsiveness to what we encounter in life. So see is also a metaphor. It doesn't only mean visually. Right. See is simply an awareness of what's beneath the surface. Exactly. And it's what's beneath the surface that in all religious traditions is understood as what is real. Real in that it is enduring. What is seen on the front end is transient. But behind creation, there's a wonderful Christian theologian named Dupree who taught at Yale in recent years. And he says that all what religion has to teach is that reality is only a window to see a reality behind it of God's resonant goodness. I've shared that in other statements. My teacher, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, saying that the challenge of a religious mindset is to look at the world, back to the word look. That's the word used repeatedly in the creation story. God every day looks after each day, also translates it as appraised and says it is good. And my teacher, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, said if you pick up the newspaper and you read the news, it doesn't look so good. The world is broken. But a religious mindset is to see the world through God's eyes, which is to say, behind those headlines, beyond the day-to-day challenges, is a quality of wholeness, a quality of love that unites all, and that is what is ultimately real. So again, Psalms, which leads to Hunter's sharing in a moment, is a way that sensitizes us. The Psalms are poems, often sung, that give us, if you will, back to seeing, a lens with how to see our world. And it's to see the world as created. That doesn't mean that God is literally pulling the strings of, step by step, but God created if you will, the language of science, the language of rules to enable an unfolding that has a quality of consciousness. This I just sent to my friend Brad Artson, who did his doctoral dissertation on this very theme, that God is the abiding consciousness within all of creation. And more scientists are writing about this quality of consciousness manifest when one is able to see it in all aspects of creation. And so to pull together Psalm 111, knowing there is so much more to teach and say about it, but a teaching from Pirkei Avot of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa taught in chapter 3, the following, paragraphs 11 to 13. Those whose fear of sinning, yirat cheto, takes precedence over their own wisdom, their wisdom will survive. But those whose wisdom takes precedence over their fear of sinning, their wisdom will not survive. Which is to say, it's for the intellectual insight to persist, it comes down to what we do, which is part of the punchline of verse 10. The beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai, a good understanding, l'chol osehem, for all their doings. That ultimately, wisdom must lead to action, and that action, or a mindset of the fear, the awe of God and the fear of doing wrong, enables the wisdom to endure. And he continued, this was a favorite teaching of his. Those whose deeds exceed their wisdom will survive. But those whose wisdom exceeds their deeds, their wisdom will not survive. That ultimately wisdom is essential, but it's judged by what you do with it. Finally, there was another favorite teaching of his, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. One with whom people are pleased, the divine spirit is pleased. And one with whom people are displeased, the divine spirit is displeased. That our relationship with God is translated into how do we deal with other people. It's not a relationship with God in the abstract. It's a relationship with God lived in how we connect and honor God's creation, which means God's creatures, which means how we deal with other people. And tomorrow, Psalm 112, those concepts of chesed ve'emet, of kindness and truth, will be translated into a person who is generous with one's resources. So that's tomorrow, 112. The mirroring, the twin of 111. 111 is the nature of God. 112, what's the nature of a good person in relationship with God? Hunter, our honoree, I was moved by your opening words before we began our class offline about Psalms. Please share, if you would, why you have and what you gain from this study.
Okay, first of all, I want to say that after the first 50, I wasn't able to participate live. So I've, like Rabbi said, I've watched most of them or all of them on YouTube, so I'm caught up. And I just want to say that when you really think about this, we've all really taken about 1.5 semesters of a class in the Psalm class to date with 111. If you multiply the hours, 45 minutes times 111. So I'm just saying that Rabbi Spitz has been our professor for about a semester and a half now, and I'm very grateful for everybody's participation, everyone on the screen, and I've really benefited from all your comments. So getting to the issue at hand, I was drawn to Psalms for several reasons. First, I have a special needs son who has developmental disability and mental illness, which he got when he went to Berkeley his first semester. And I realized early on as I've been reading these Psalms, the importance of gradualism, and that everything that's taken place in compiling these Psalms over about 500 years plus happened for a reason, I believe. No matter how much editing took place, when you read these Psalms, I feel that you're reading about constantly the tumult and the disagreements and the battles and the grind, but you're also reading about the goodness and the righteousness. And you have to believe that in time, like the illustration Rabbi pointed out about the Rabbi Greenberg having been a newspaper reporter, that when you pick up the newspaper or watch the TV for the news, you're seeing immediate news that in many cases is negative or wrong. But behind this, in order to get to this state in our lives after thousands of years, goodness and righteousness in a slow, gradual way has won out. And that's how you have to look at it, I think. And that's why Psalms is attractive to me, is that you're led to believe that you have to make the best every day of the way that things turn out in our life. And how can we make that positive and righteous? So that, in as short a way as I can, is what drew me to Psalms. If we just accept the negative that took place thousands of years ago and all the time in between to now, how are we going to improve, and how are we going to teach our younger people that it's worth living for? So I think, in one word, I think it's all about gradualism stemming from righteousness and goodness. That's the issue.
Well, Hunter, again, when you speak, my hand goes to my heart, and it's because I know that for you and Harriet, and for Ian and Nathan, you live lives that are grounded in the faith that life is ultimately good. And I thank you for being an active participant in Psalms and for sharing yourself now with us as a group.